You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today on the 40th edition of the Useless Information Retrocast, I've got a lineup of fascinating and completely true stories for you. That includes a couple who couldn't quit one another, and I mean they really couldn't quit one another. They married and divorced each other over and over again. Or how about a man who escaped from a correctional facility in Iowa only to be spotted as a contestant on a popular national TV show? And yes, he was using his real name. Plus, I'll tell you about a man who was fined for failing to give his wife a goodbye kiss. Well, all those stories, the question of the day, today's retro sponsor, and so much more, they're all coming up next on the Retrocast. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today I've selected a bunch of stories that all have something to do with love. After all, February is the month of love. And yes, I'm a little late for Valentine's Day. And I actually put these stories together for last Valentine's Day, not this year's, last year's. And for whatever reason, I never got to record it. So I thought I would present them to you today. So think of this as being a little late for this year's Valentine's Day, or maybe I'm just very, very early for next year's Valentine's Day. Anyway, here we go. So let's start with a 1915 story of 14-year-old Clara Parsons and 17-year-old Peter Gunn, who were both orphans being raised in Chicago by family members. Clara, whose mother was deceased and for whatever reason not being raised by her father, although he was still alive, instead, she was being raised by her grandmother, that's Mrs. Elizabeth McGregor, who lived at 2828 Wilcox Avenue, and Clara had lived with her for 5 years. As for Peter, he'd been brought up by his grandfather, David Nicholson, but for unspecified reasons, he was now living with his uncle, Alexander Gunn, who lived at 314 South Francisco Avenue, also in Chicago. As with so many young romances, Clara and Peter met while attending the Calhoun Public School. Little side note is that school is now closed, but it stood, and I don't think the original building is there, but it stood at the corner of West Jackson Boulevard and South Francisco Avenue, basically just a block from where his uncle lived. Anyway, Clara was in the 6th grade and Peter was in the 8th, and during his vacations, he would drive a grocery wagon. Now, the two desperately desired to be married, but they were fearful of telling their foster parents about what they wanted to do. Then, one day, Clara came home with a cheap silver chain and a cross around her neck. Of course, it was a gift from Peter, and her grandmother, she just expressed her disdain for, quote, that Gunn orphan. She was determined to keep the young couple apart, and she promised Clara a new dress. So on June 27th of 1915, Grandma gave Clara $5, which is around $160 today, to go purchase supplies for the new dress. Well, Clara took the money, but instead of returning home with the items, she opted to spend the day with Peter. The two purchased popcorn and soda, and then they went for a ride on the streetcars. But afterward, Clara was afraid to return home without the correct change, but Peter told her not to worry. Did she go home? Of course not. Boyfriend Peter had a much better solution. You see, it rained all that evening, so Clara spent the night sheltered in the back of Peter's home. Not that it was really his home. And the next morning, they used the remaining money to head out into the real world and start a new life for themselves. They were going to live on their own. It wouldn't be until 17 days later, that's during the evening of July 13th of 1915, that two detectives would cut through the thick brush along the Des Plaines River just outside of LaGrange, Illinois, and under an oak tree they could see the glow of a fading fire. And beside the fire they found Clara and Peter sound asleep, huddled together to stay warm. The detectives aroused the two young lovers, and instinctively Peter jumped to his feet with his fists clenched, and he was ready to defend himself. He blurted out,
"Leave us alone."
To which one of the detectives said,
"Come on, Peter. Come on, Clara. Vacation is over. Everything is all right. We are going back to Grandpa and Grandma. We are waiting for you back in the city and are worried."
And with that, the two ended their half-month wandering through the Garden of Eden. The two were in great shape health-wise, but they didn't look it. Their hair was unkempt, their clothing was in tatters, and their lips, they were stained from the berries that they had been eating. Peter was taken to the Warren Avenue police station while Clara was turned over to the juvenile detention home. Each then told of what had happened. We'll start with Clara, and then we'll hear from Peter.
It was fine to get out in the air where there was grass and trees. We walked all day long through the woods. We played down on the riverbank and waded in the water. It was all so new. It rained the second night. We didn't know where we were. At first I was afraid it was dark and there was lightning, but Peter made a little tent out of his raincoat. Then we built a fire and sat under the tree and told stories until I fell asleep. We went into LaGrange and bought things. Sometimes we would eat in the railroad station, but most of the time we'd go down to the river and have our meals on the bank. It was fun. Soon the money ran out. My shoes had fallen to pieces from the wet grass, and my dress was all torn. We were awfully hungry and cold sometimes. Peter went away one day and brought me back a piece of an old blanket, and I made it do for a skirt. Peter used to go out and bring back potatoes. He brought them from some of the campers at Western Springs, and sometimes I would walk with him. One night when it rained, they let us have a tent, but it wasn't as nice as the fire and the raincoat out under the trees. Peter also learned how to dive in the river. He would stand on the bank and wait till some little fishes swam by. Then he would jump in and grab them. I used to gather wild gooseberries and cook the little fishes on hot stones and have a fine dinner. Sometimes it was lonely and many times I was afraid, but Peter never left me alone at night. We would build the fire up high and tell stories and plan things until we fell asleep. I never wanted to leave. I would like to be there now.
It was great. Sometimes it wasn't enough to eat, and it gets awful cold and wet out there too, and it looks like it just kept raining most of the time, but Clara never complained once. I used to do everything I could to get things to eat. Sometimes I would walk miles and beg from campers. Once I sneaked away and went home and got a good meal. I filled my pockets up with things to eat and brought them back. Clara was waiting by the fire under the oak tree. She had ate a lot of berries. We had a big dinner that night. I guess we would have been out there yet if it hadn't been for some boyfriends of mine that I asked to bring food out to us. I think they told the police where to find us.
Police Lieutenant D.C. Fitzgerald at the Warren Avenue station stated,
"You newspaper fellows have sort of overdone that call the wild business. This looks to me, however, like a real example of it. There they were, two healthy young animals who were primitive enough to get back to nature and live on it. Can you imagine a grocer's boy diving for fish in a river and a Chicago schoolgirl living on wild berries?"
So you're probably wondering, did the cave boy and the cave girl, as they were anointed by the press, ever marry? Well, I can't say for certain, but if I track down the correct Clara Parsons on Ancestry, she didn't marry Peter. Instead, she married Harry Seabaugh in January of 1920 when she was 19 years of age. The two had raised 5 children, and she passed away on February 9th of 1994 at 95 years of age. As for Peter, I did find him in the 1910 census, and I did find out his full name was really George Peter Gunn, and he was born in Scotland. He married Ethel Barber on July 13th of 1917. That would make him somewhere in the 19 to 20-year range. But after that, he just seemed to vanish. I couldn't find out any more information on him. Next up, we have the story of Dorothy and David King Funk, who were first married to one another on December 29th of 1950. But after 7 years of marriage, the two decided to get divorced. They simply couldn't live together any longer. But neither could they stay apart. They then remarried, but that union ended in divorce in 1962. They then remarried again and divorced in 1964. And then they remarried again and divorced in 1965. You know, one would think that 4 marriages and divorces would be enough, but it wasn't for the two of them. The couple remarried again on August 8th of 1966 in Las Vegas. And as you could probably guess, that marriage didn't last very long either. Just 7 months later, that's on March 3rd of the following year, 44-year-old Dorothy filed a complaint of cruelty against her then 64-year-old husband, David. That fifth marriage would be dissolved in Superior Court, and the two agreed to follow the terms of their 1965 settlement. In it, Dorothy would receive $500 per month, that's around $4,200 today, in alimony, and that would be paid until she remarried. In addition, she would also receive $17,000, that's $142,500 today, which was due to her under that agreement. But it stipulated that she would forfeit at least temporarily if she married him a sixth time. As to how David was able to pay her that much, it turns out he owns 7 Greyhound racing tracks. Lots of betting, lots of money. So that left me wondering, did they remarry? Again, I turned to Ancestry to try and find the answer to that question, but I couldn't find any conclusive proof one way or the other. My hunch is that since I couldn't find any records of a sixth marriage, they finally went their separate ways, but of course I could be wrong. The good news, if really there can be any in a couple that divorces 5 times, is that the two never had any children together. Now, David did have 5 children, but they weren't with Dorothy. But Dorothy, she had him beat by far in the marriage department. What it determined is that she had been married to 3 other men, and one of them she had married twice. That's 4 marriages plus the 5 to David Funk. That's 9 marriages by the age of 44. Holy cow. When I was a kid, one of my favorite TV shows was The Dating Game. And if you're old enough, you probably remember it very well. Basically, a single bachelorette or sometimes a bachelor would ask a series of questions to 3 hidden contestants of the opposite sex. Then, after all the questioning was done, they would choose the one that they wanted to go out on a date with. Now, some of those on the show would go on to fame and fortune. In fact, some of them were famous already when they were on the show. That includes Farrah Fawcett, Sally Fields, Steve Martin, Michael Jackson, Tom Selleck, and so on. But there were those that didn't go quite as well. In particular, the most famous is probably serial killer Rodney Alcala, who appeared on the show in 1978, and he may have killed in excess of 100 people. What I'm going to do is add one lesser-known incident to that list. It's the story of 26-year-old Rock Island, Illinois resident James A. Shelton, who was one of the 3 bachelors trying to convince a cheerleader for the Los Angeles Rams to select him for a date. That episode was filmed in Hollywood on September 13th of 1978 and will be broadcast on WQAD-TV, which served the Quad Cities region of Illinois and Iowa, on November 6th of that year. Well, watching that day was a former employee of a Davenport, Iowa correctional facility who recognized Shelton, who was using his real name on the show. He was an inmate who had escaped from a minimum security facility nearly 10 months prior on November 4th of 1977. It turns out that Shelton had been there less than a month, and the reason he was in prison was that he had stolen from a department store that he had worked at. Anyway, that former employee quickly contacted officials at the correctional center, and then they contacted the TV station so they could get a look at the videotape. They needed to make sure he really was the guy they were looking for. Artie Duncan, who was the director of the facility, told the Des Moines Register,
"I couldn't hardly believe it. That's why I wanted to check it out to make sure it was the right person."
And he was. It definitely was the right man. But what was interesting is that he portrayed himself as a clothing designer from Chicago. In reality, the closest Shelton ever got to working in the clothing industry was when he worked for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Just coincidentally, one of the bachelors who was sitting next to Shelton on the show was a probation officer. Anyway, police in California were alerted to keep a lookout for Shelton, but they were unsuccessful. About 5 weeks later, this is early December, Shelton contacted his Davenport lawyer, a guy named Doran Shifley, and he expressed his desire to turn himself in. He also told Schiffley that in addition to appearing on the dating game, he had also made 2 appearances on The Gong Show, but those had yet to be broadcast in Davenport. And just a little side notice that both those shows were the brainchild of the late Chuck Barris. Finally, on Monday, December 11th of 1978, Attorney Schiffley met his client as he stepped off a plane at the Des Moines Municipal Airport. But before turning himself over to authorities, Shelton agreed to an interview with the Quad City Times. He told them,
I knew that when I used my actual name and people saw my face, I would be recognized. But I didn't know it would be this soon.
He added,
It was inevitable I was coming back. I taped the show a while ago. I thought that by the time it was aired here, I would be making preparations to come back. It just aired too soon.
As to why he left the correctional facility in the first place, he partly blamed it on the weather.
It was getting cold here, so it was inevitable that I go to California. It was 98 degrees in LA and 27 degrees here.
And finally,
with 4 months left on a 1-year probation, it was kinda stupid to leave.
Well, on Wednesday, December 20th of 1978, Shelton was once again back in a courtroom. While the prosecutor sought a 5-year term in a real prison, Judge Nathan Grant went easy on Shelton. He sentenced him to 1 year at the same correctional facility, but he could be released sooner for good behavior, the judge said.
I don't condone your actions, but the report is pretty good. You're a good worker, and you've had good jobs, and you've created no problems for anybody.
If you're curious, unlike serial killer Rodney Alcala, who was selected by the Bachelorette for a date, although he kind of creeped her out and she never went through with it, James Shelton wasn't as lucky. He wasn't selected for that date with the Rams cheerleader. And through the magic of technology, I'm going to splice in a bit of an addendum to the story that you just heard. And I'm recording this a day after I finish recording the entire Retrocast. Anyway, while I was uploading the episode to the server for distribution, I decided to check to see if I could locate the episode of the dating game with James Shelton on it. But I couldn't because every search I did for a show from 1978 kept bringing up the same exact clip. You know, the one with serial killer Rodney Alcala on it. And I should point out that none of these are the complete show. It's just the 9-minute segment that he appeared in. And then all of a sudden it hit me. The 2 were on the dating game on the same exact day, September 13th of 1978. Now, the 2 definitely didn't appear in the same segment because I can watch the Rodney Alcala one, but I don't know if James Shelton appeared in a different segment of that same episode, or more likely they filmed multiple episodes on that same day. I mean, what are the chances? Now, if anyone knows where to locate the video with James Shelton on it, just let me know. I'd love to take a look at it. And with that, I'll return you to our regularly scheduled programming, which I already said I recorded yesterday. A few months ago, my wife Mary Jane had to work late. I think she had parents' night at the school she works at, and I had to feed myself. And I have no problem cooking for myself, but usually what I like to do is find someplace quiet where I can simply sit and read a book. Well, that night I had to do some shopping, so I found myself sitting at a table at a Burger King restaurant, and I was consuming an Impossible Whopper. And if you don't know, that's made with the plant-based Impossible Burger. In other words, it has no meat in it. To be honest, I couldn't tell the difference between it and a traditional beef burger, although to be fair, the pickles and the condiments and everything they put on the sandwich, it probably would have masked any subtle differences that there may have been in flavor. Which got me thinking, when was the first fake meat commercially sold? And that's the question that I pose to you today. When was the first fake meat marketed? Now, you don't need an exact year. If you can just get the correct decade, you're going to get full credit on this mini quiz. Anyway, stick around for a bit and I'll let you know the answer at the end of this podcast.
And now Susie Swan sings to us. Listen.
My advice, says Susie, you like this brand new kind of lather, so be choosy. Swan gives you beauty lather, rich as cream. Your skin stays soft as any dream, and fresh as dew. I swan, do you? Says Susie.
And ladies, if you make white floating Swan soap your complexion soap, You'll see for yourself that Susie Swan's advice is good advice, because Swan really does give you a wonderful new kind of beauty lather for your skin. A new kind of lather that's so rich, so creamy, it smooths onto your skin as softly as a caress. A new kind of lather that whisks away dirt, leaves your skin so clean it fairly glows. And Swan is so mild, so gentle, that it pampers your skin while it cleanses. And Swan rinses away so completely, too. Your face doesn't feel drawn and over-soaped when you're through washing it. Instead, it's left smooth and fresh. Another advantage of Swan's wonderful new kind of beauty lather. Another reason to get Swan soap for a new and wonderful kind of complexion care.
That commercial for Swan soap is from the December 8th, 1947 broadcast of My Friend Irma. This particular episode was titled The Eyes Have It. The series was broadcast on the CBS radio network from April 11th of 1947 to August 23rd of 1954. And the show centered around the stereotypical ditzy blonde who is named Irma Peterson, and of course all the crazy situations she'd get herself into with her friends. Now, My Friend Irma proved incredibly popular with a listening audience and has spawned 2 films. The first of which was the 1949 movie My Friend Irma, and that launched the screen careers of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Plus, there was a television show, a comic strip, there was even a comic book series that was penned by the legendary Stan Lee, plus a stage play of the same name. Basically, for a while it seemed like My Friend Irma was just about everywhere, but by the mid-1950s, the entire media franchise, it just kind of fizzled out. As for Swan soap, it was first sold by Lever Brothers in the United States in 1941, and that was to compete with the popular Ivory soap. But Swan soap wasn't a new creation. It had been around for a long time before that, just not in the United States. For example, I found the following advertisement that appeared in the January 21st, 1899 edition of the Exeter Flying Post. Messrs. Lever Brothers have added to their manufacturers a floating soap which they have designated Swan soap. The ingredients are guaranteed to be pure edible oils and fats, and in addition to toilet and bath purposes, the soap is suitable for cleaning silver plate and china, linen, lace, painted woodwork, etc. It is white in color, has a pleasing perfume, and is certainly a good emollient. While Swan soap is no longer manufactured, my wife and I do have a bar of it in the original packaging, and that's simply because we have a display case of vintage toiletries in our upstairs bathroom. And now we're up to the portion of the Retrocast where I'm going to share with you 5 footnotes to history. And these stories require a little research on my part, so I'm just going to read them exactly as they're written many years ago. And our first entry is from March 18th of 1904. This is published in the Daily Mirror on page 2. The headline reads, "Ugly Chauffeurs Wanted. Alarm Society Taboos Fascinating Young Men." There were a few weeks ago too many chauffeurs. Now there seems a possibility of being too few. It is not good nowadays to be a good-looking young chauffeur. You will obtain no situation if you are. The motor car is responsible for many things besides accidents. Not a few runaway matches have resulted, and several young ladies have, with dire result, fallen victim to the fascinations of the leather-clad, begoggled man at the wheel. A few days ago, a rich gentleman well known in racing circles and in smart society missed at one and the same time his daughter, his chauffeur, and his motor car. He put 2 and 2 together, and after much expenditure of time and money, he recovered the erring damsel and the car. He wanted to get rid of the chauffeur, so he had to part with £10,000 too. Now he's engaged an elderly, much-married driver for his motor, and peace reigns. But there are many other cases. The one-time romance of the groom and his employer's daughter is over and done with. The good-looking chauffeur has superseded him. Society is alarmed, and many chauffeurs have received a month's notice. In fact, in one case, a month's wages in lieu of notice has been meted out to an over-fascinating motor driver by an apprehensive father. The day of the elderly chauffeur is approaching. The older and uglier he is, the more certain is he of a situation. Advertisements worded as follows are destined to appear in various newspapers. Wanted, elderly chauffeurs, must be married, children preferred, personal blemishes not objected to, experience not so much an essential as age. As I was recording this, I couldn't help but think back to many years ago as a teacher, and I was still single at this point. A girl just blurted out in the middle of class, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect like, for a man, you're really ugly. And just why do I mention this little tidbit? It's because I am perfectly qualified for this job. According to my former student, who I should mention was a senior in high school at the time, I am ugly. I'm married. I don't have children, unfortunately, but I do have personal blemishes, and I don't have a lot of experience as a chauffeur, but I do have the age. I think I better apply. Next up, we have a story that was printed on April 6 of 1923 on page 9 of the San Pedro, California News Pilot. Headline is Today's Oddest News Story, Pasadena, April 6th. $10, that's around $190 today. $10 was the price set on A.L. Burdick's goodbye kiss yesterday when the newlywed was overtaken by traffic officers while on his way back home to bid his wife an affectionate bye-bye. Burdick was traveling homeward at 33 miles an hour when overtaken. That's around 53 kilometers per hour. That's slow by today's standards, but keep in mind cars did not go very fast in the early 1920s. Now let's take a listen to his excuse.
I forgot to kiss my wife goodbye,
he explained. Officers accompanied Burdick to his home, waited for a moment while the osculation was performed, then escorted the young man back to the police station.
His wife berated him,
said Officer Hartung when the case was called before Police Judge Frank C. Dunham.
She said he had kissed her when he left, and his explanation was a poor excuse.
Well, the kiss ought to be worth $10,
was Dunham's decision. He knocked off $5 as a testimonial of his appreciation of the man's affection for his wife. Now, $5 is around $95 today. The moral of the story? Make sure you kiss your wife before you leave the house. It could be costly if you don't. Now for this next one, I'm going to read two stories for you, and that's basically because one story completes the other. And the first was published on February 23rd, 1954 on the front page of the La Crosse Tribune. Now the headline on this one is due to bad translation, and I'll explain that in a bit. It says it started in Bad as Love is Sick, Pen is Mightier Than Wars, 40-year romance climaxed, Minneapolis Associated Press. The romance of two German youngsters before the start of World War I comes to fruition March 6th in a marriage ceremony at Anchorage, Alaska, after some 40 years of pen palling. Eric Tobin, now 54, was called too young to become engaged to Charlotte Stott, 53, when they were childhood sweethearts in Bad Love is Sick, Germany. Now, Bad Love is Sick didn't sound quite right to me, so I did some checking, and in fact, Ancestry came to the rescue again, and she was born in Bad Lausick, Germany. So now that we've made that correction, let's continue. After Eric was called up for the army, Charlotte's letters followed him through the war years. Out of the army, instead of returning home, he joined the Merchant Marine and in 1926 settled in America. The last several years, he has lived at a boarding house operated by Mrs. Oscar Westland at Mound, Minnesota, just outside of Minneapolis. Charlotte's letters still came. He did, however, regale Mrs. Westland with tales of what a wonderful cook Charlotte was. So Mrs. Westland last year sponsored Charlotte and employed her. A planned wedding last Christmas was abandoned when Tobin lost his job. Now working for the government in Alaska, he recently wrote to set the date and told of an apartment he has for his bride-to-be in Anchorage. Her white satin wedding dress all ready, Miss Stott boards a plane for Alaska Friday. And that's the end of the first story. Let's continue with the follow-up article. And this appeared on page 18 of the March 10th, 1954 edition of the Register Guard, and the headline is Couple Wed After 40 Years of Separation. Anchorage, Alaska, Associated Press. A romance that began in Germany and did not cool in 40 years of hardship and separation was culminated over the weekend in the marriage of Miss Charlotte Stott, 54, and Eric Tobin, 56. Little side note here is they seem to have aged quite a bit in just 2 weeks. In fact, Charlotte was now a year older and Eric was 2 years older. Anyway, back to the story. Tobin lost trace of Miss Stott shortly after he went to war in Germany in 1914. All efforts to find each other failed until he took out American citizenship papers. Then Miss Stott obtained his address in Alaska from a German consulate. Their correspondence was renewed, and eventually Tobin made arrangements for Miss Stott to come here. She arrived a few days ago, and the wedding ceremony was quickly arranged. The wedding, read in German, was performed in the Anchorage Lutheran Church. The bride wore a white satin wedding gown, the veil of which belonged to her mother, and used her mother's wedding band in the double ring ceremony. And this is my favorite part of the story. The bridal gown, carefully packed, was smuggled out of the Russian occupation zone of Germany shortly before Miss Stott escaped over the border to the Western Zone. Wow. For our fourth story, we have another one from the 1950s. This particular one appeared on the front page of the Scott County Times on March 4th of 1959. That's in Forest, Mississippi. And before I read it, I should point out this shows the racism that existed at the time, because race really had nothing to do with this story. The headline on this one is Negro with Fourth Wife Seeks Divorce from 3 Others in Court. A Forest Negro, now legally married to his 4th wife, has filed divorce proceedings against 3 other wives in Scott County Chancery Court. The plaintiff is Percy Caples, and the defendants are listed as Mary Dean Caples, Aura Coleman Caples, and Nettie Triplett Caples. All 3 cases are returnable at the April term of the Chancery Court. The Negro is represented by Frank Mize, Forest attorney. I did do some checking, and I'm not sure if the divorces ever went through, but he didn't live much longer after this. He was born on August 4th, 1893, and died in December of 1966, and the story is from 1959. And the last tidbit I have for you today appeared on page 16 of the Hanford Sentinel on October 2nd of 1979, and that paper is in Hanford, California. The headline reads, Bridal Party Was Up a Tree, Fairfield, California, United Press International. Steve Bauer and Bridget Perdoni were high for their wedding. They exchanged vows in a tree. Bauer wore top hat and tails, and Miss Perdoni was in a white gown with a train as they were married 12 feet or around 3.7 meters above the ground, standing on a branch of an old oak tree in the Sassoon Valley. Bridegroom, best man, 3 bridesmaids, and Northern Solano Municipal Judge Curtis Singleton all were hoisted aloft on a construction crane to various branches at various heights for Sunday's ceremony. Bauer, owner of the Long Branch Tree Service, said he loved trees so much he decided to use one as the venue for his marriage. Quote, You and I stand together in the mighty tree and feel the strength of its branches, the groom told the bride during the service. We feel its roots growing stronger as we grow stronger together, unquote. The couple honeymooned in the redwood tree country of Northern California. Where else? Now, I did check, and the ceremony was held on September 30th of 1979. So early in the podcast, I'd asked you when the first fake meat was commercially sold. Do you think you know the answer? Well, it can all be traced back to John Harvey Kellogg, who was appointed director of the Battle Creek Medical Surgical Sanitarium in 1876, although that's not the date of the first fake meat. Anyway, over the next several decades, Kellogg experimented with a wide variety of treatments that were intended to improve one's health. And some of them, like exercise and fresh air, they were way ahead of their time. But there were others, like vibration and slapping machines and yogurt enemas. Well, let's just face it, they were downright crazy. But Kellogg also believed that one could avoid a number of ailments by eating a diet rich in bland, vegetable, and grain-based foods, and that's how the cereal company that bears his name came about. The story goes that one day he was talking with Dr. Charles W. Dabney, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and somehow they got into a discussion regarding the issue of supplying the world's ever-growing population with enough protein. And that's when Dabney suggested to Kellogg that he should develop a plant-based meat substitute. It took a lot of experimentation, but eventually Kellogg came up with a product that he named Nuttos, and that was just a mixture of nut and wheat ingredients. It was marketed as the, quote, perfect substitute for flesh food, unquote, and it became available in 1896. And that's the answer, 1896. If you guess the 1890s, you get credit on the quiz. Meanwhile, Kellogg continued to refine his meat substitute, and in 1899 he introduced Protos. The name mashes together, of course, the word protein with the suffix "oaks" or full of. In other words, full of protein, and a U.S. patent was granted in 1901. And while Protos never became a household name, like Kellogg's Corn Flakes, it was popular with vegans and vegetarians. Believe it or not, that canned meat substitute, it would stay on the market until Kellogg's discontinued it 101 years later in the year 2000. But if you'd like to try it for yourself, vegans have attempted to recreate the formula. And here's just one of those recipes. All you need is a half a cup of creamy natural peanut butter, 1 cup of wheat gluten, 1 cup of vegetable stock, 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, half of a medium onion, you have to chop that up, 1 teaspoon of Italian herb blend, a pinch of salt, and then all you do is you mix it all together, place it in a double boiler, and steam it for 3 hours, stirring occasionally. Then you let it cool, turn out the platter, and you slice it up. You know what? I think I'm going to skip making it myself. I'm just going to stick to my tasty Impossible Burger. Well, I hope you enjoyed the stories that I selected for today's Retrocast. And before I let you go, I just want to let you know, and I know you've been very, very concerned about this, I am not mentioned in the Epstein files. I only mention this because the story has been big news lately, and last week while we were watching the news, I made an off-the-cuff remark to my wife that even I'm probably mentioned in the Epstein files. Now, before going any further, I just want to make clear that I am not making light of the seriousness of the crimes that were committed. They were awful. This is just based on my general observation that just about anyone and everyone seems to be mentioned somewhere in those documents. And of course, as you know, my name is Steve Silverman, and that's a fairly common name. There are many people with that name. So in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking, well, I'm not in there, obviously, but probably some other Steve Silverman is. Well, I did a quick search on the Department of Justice website, and I was proven wrong. My name turned up absolutely no matches. I tried Steve Silverman, Steven Silverman, nothing. Now, I haven't told him yet, but my brother's name is in the Epstein files, although I know it's not him personally. Instead, it's someone with the same name who penned an article for the Financial Times. So if you'd like to see if you're in the files, just head on over to the Department of Justice and do a search for your name. Like me, you probably never had any interaction with Epstein, but your name may be there. Anyway, the Useless Information Podcast is proud to be part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So visit airwavemedia.com to explore their ever-growing collection of some of the very best podcasts out there. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Take care, everyone. Bye.